Delta Force is a forgotten franchise that marked the childhood of many people. This game is basically defined the tactical FPS games together with Rainbow Six. Thousands of people who were in the military at the time the games were released played Delta Force and introduced these games to their children. This is why you see a lot of people nowadays saying that Delta Force was their first FPS game, or at least their first multiplayer game. It's said that because of the stupidity of the company that produced the Delta Force games, the franchise began to decline until it was forgotten and recently resurrected with a new free-to-play game. Because of this, I decided to play all the games in the franchise and do a superficial retrospective on how Delta Force declined. The first game in the franchise was released in 1998, developed by Nova Logic, and it's basically a military simulator FPS based on the operations of the United States Delta Force. The game is very simple. You're your soldier and can customize him. After that, you go on missions, complete your objectives, and repeat this over and over again. The game has a limited quantity of weapons, but most of it are good and quite functional with the exception of the MP5 that sucks. The missions are also very simple. They all involve objectives like rescuing civilians, eliminating enemies, or destroying equipment, and in some missions you need to extract. The map is quite wide, but a good part of it is empty, with you having some bases and other related things. But one really impressive thing is the amount of missions. The game initially has only 5, but as you play and unlock new missions, you have 40 of it. But the real reason why that first Delta Force was so good is its gameplay. Okay, don't get me wrong, Delta Force has aged very badly. If you're not used to old games, you probably think the game is trend, but when the game was released, it was pretty good. Delta Force was made on voxel space, a engine used by Nova Logic, and basically was this engine that made Delta Force gameplay so good. I mean, not the gameplay, but the scenarios too. But before talking about the voxel space engine, we need to talk about what voxel spaces are. Voxel spaces are basically 3D environments represented using voxels, being basically volumetric pixels, and I really need to stop to say the word basically so many times. Unlike traditional 3D graphics that use polygons to create surface, voxels represent volume in space, allowing for more detailed and dynamic modeling of environments. Each voxel holds data like color, density, and textures, enabling more realistic and interactive 3D worlds. And Nova Logic utilized this concept to the voxel space engine, especially to render large, open, and destructible environments in their games. By using voxels, the engine was able to create expansive terrains with realistic features, allowing for detailed terrain manipulation and dynamic interactions within the game world, which was significant innovation at the time. For example, as much as it's boring to walk around that gigantic scenario with almost nothing besides basics and derivatives, these scenarios were only possible thanks to voxel space. In 1992, there was no conventional ADS that is seen in modern FPS games. Delta Force uses this type of zoom on the right side so you can see enemies far away. It may not seem like it, but it works very well. You use the normal camera to see where the shots are coming from and aim at the area where they are coming from, and use the zoom on your side to see the enemies and shoot them. Even the fact that you can see the bullets from far is already something impressive. In Delta Force, you can be using an SMG. If you use the zoom and manage to aim at the enemy, you can already kill him from a distance, and it's just very satisfying to kill with a sniper here. Delta Force is a difficult game. Even on low difficulties, the enemies give you almost a hit kill. But something really cool about this game is the fact that the difficulty choice not only changes the damage and the number of the enemies, but also changes how the AI behaves against the player. I'm not saying that the AI in this game is a great example in terms of intelligence. Even on higher difficulties, it's actually kinda dumb. But this detail related to the difficult and the AI is something pretty good, and was the base for the amazing AI of Halo Combat Evolved in 2001. Delta Force had a significant impact on the game industry, especially in the tactical shooter and military simulation genres. The game emphasized tactics and strategy over fast-paced action, mission, encouraging players to carefully plan their movements and teamwork. Yeah, teamwork, cause Delta Force helped popularize online multiplayer, allowing large-scale combat and influencing future multiplayer games. You could literally play with 32 players on a large-scale map. How could you not think this amazing? It's bizarre that this game was released in the same year and month as Rainbow Six. Tactical shooter players really got lucky. The focus on realism and immersive gameplay set new standards for military shooters, influencing many games in the genre for years to come. Of course, this success means sequels, and over time, we've had many sequels. In 1999 was released Delta Force 2. The game is a complete improvement of the first game, improving in practically every aspect. The game has two modes, the campaign and the side missions. The names are self-explanatory. The campaign with longer and more elaborated missions, like the missions from the first game, and the side missions with shorter missions. Yeah, missions. The variety of missions was significantly improved. In addition to eliminating enemies or rescuing hostages, the game introduced more complex objectives like intercepting transmissions, destroying infrastructures, protecting strategy zones, and evacuating personnel. This increase in mission diversity brought more depth to the gameplay, requiring more tactical planning. Delta Force 2 introduced secondary objectives in many missions, like collecting intelligence or eliminating specific targets within larger enemies groups, and this added complexity to missions and required players to think more strategically and plan their actions carefully. The mission structure became more diverse, so many missions allowed for a more open-ended approach, where players could choose different ways to complete their objectives, either through direct confrontations or using more stealthy tactics. This created scenarios where player choices had a real impact on how missions played out. Delta Force 2 introduced urban areas and complex structures in their missions like villages, factories, checkpoints, and this added new challenges and required more tactical combat. In summary, everything related to mission structure and level design has been improved. Playing Delta Force 2 is an extremely satisfying experience. The voxel space ending used on this game was better than the version used on the first game, and this further enhances the experience of playing the missions and the immersion you feel while playing it, as well as helping in technical terms. The upgraded ending allowed for greater interaction with the environment, like the ability to enter buildings, use cover more effectively, and interact with more objects within the map. This made navigation more dynamic, requiring players to adapt their tactics according to the situation. The voxel space ending was adjusted to support more dynamic vehicle interactions and better terrain physics. The movement physics were enhanced, allowing vehicles to behave more realistically when interacting with the environment. The enhanced ending allowed for more realistic sound effects, including environmental sounds like footsteps in the snow, distant gunshots, and explosions. The game also featured a richer atmospheric experience, with weather effects like rain, fog, and volumetric clouds, increasing the game's immersion. The ending was significantly optimized to improve performance, allowing for larger and more detailed maps without sacrificing frame rate. The game could render more objectives simultaneously and handle more complex environments, leading to a smoother gaming experience. The ending was enhanced to improve graphical rendering, including more detailed textures and sophisticated lighting effects, making the environment more realistic and visually impressive. It may not seem like it today, but Delta Force 2 was a technical miracle, but of course, the game would be nothing with a good shooting system. Delta Force 2 significantly expanded the available arsenal. Don't get me wrong, it's still pretty simple, but better than the first game. Delta Force 1 had a limited number of weapons, while the second, despite still being limited, introduced more variety, including assault rifles, machine guns, sniper sniper rifles, pistols, explosives, and giving players more options for different tactical situations. In Delta Force 1, the aiming was basic and not very precise, but in Delta Force 2, the implementation of a more detailed aiming system with finer adjustments allowed players to have a more accurate shooting experience, especially with sniper rifles and other long-range weapons. Delta Force 2 brought smoother and more realistic animations for weapon firing. The sound of gunshots was also improved, providing a more immersive and authentic experience, with distinct sounds for each type of weapon. In Delta Force 2, the weapons offered more interactivity with the environment, like the ability to shoot through glass or destroy smaller obstacles, something not possible in the first game. And what I'm gonna say now doesn't necessarily have anything to do with the game's shooting or combat system, but the HUD and minimap are much better than the HUD and minimap from the first game. Delta Force 2 was an incredible game, improving on all the elements of the first one and bringing an even more solid multiplayer. I won't go too much deep in terms of multiplayer in this video, cause I'm not familiar with all Delta Force multiplayer. What made me like these games is the immersion that the games bring through technical terms, gameplay and level design, and with the success of Delta Force 2, more sequels were to come, but honestly, it took a while for them to get over the second game. In 2000, Delta Force Land Warrior was released, and I don't know, this game is pretty good, but I still prefer the second one. Voxel Space just made other miracle. The game was able to create more realistic terrains with irregular surfaces and a more natural topography. The rendering of large areas of terrain was more efficient with this technology, as voxels could be processed more quickly than traditional polygon-based maps. Since Voxel Space handles large amounts of 3D terrain data efficiently, it helped maintain stable performance when rendering expensive maps, especially with the PC hardware of the time. This was a significant advantage because it allowed players to explore large areas without noticeable drops in performance. Land Warrior introduced a greater variety of weapons and equipment. The diversity of weapons and the ability to choose between different types for various situations enriched the combat system, allowing players to tailor their gameplay style to each mission. It was simple, the best shooting and combat system in the franchise so far, but at the same time, the design of the weapons are terrible. Look at this weapon. What are you seeing is an AUG. The question is, how did the AUG become this? The movement system was improved, providing more precise and fluid control during combat. The game's physics were also more realistic, with better interaction with the environment, which reflected how players moved and used the terrain to their advantage. Combat animations like firing weapons or shooting from different positions were also enhanced, making the experience more immersive and dynamic. This is why you find it much harder to aim with the sniper than in other games, which I didn't like, but I understand what they wanna do. In summary, Delta Force Land War is a good game that has added a lot in terms of weapon and realism, but that's just it. It's not that impressive. Delta Force 2 was good because it improved every aspect of the first game, while Land War improved just some aspects of Delta Force 2 but did improve others. At least the game's HUD is pretty good and has the Yeti in it. Yeah, I couldn't not talk about it. In 2002, Delta Force Task Force Dagger was released. Now it's not a game, but a standalone expansion pack for Land Warrior developed by Zombie Inc. and just published by Nova Logic. For this reason, I won't go into detail about Task Force Dagger in this video, cause it's all very similar. The game takes place entirely in the Afghan War, so the setting here is very good, cause it's an expansion of Land War. Unfortunately, I couldn't play more of the game and record more gameplays cause it simply stopped working on my PC. But honestly, it's a pretty good game and a great addition to Land Land Warrior. Still in 2002 was released Delta Force Urban Warfare, developed by Rebellion Developments and just published by Nova Logic, now releasing exclusively for PS1. For the first time, Delta Force was released for consoles, and this directly impacted the way the game works. Firstly, the gameplay is kinda weird. It was even inferior to Medal of Honor released for the same console. I mean, we are in 2002. This game could have been released for PS2 instead of PS1. The fact that they released an FPS game for PS1 in 2002 greatly limits what the game could be. The PS1 is not a Nintendo 64 with all controls having an analog stick. When you make an FPS game for the PS1, you have to deal with the fact that not everyone who is playing the game will have a DualShock. So you have to adapt the button layout for people who are playing with the DualShock and with the normal controller. Playing a game in 2002, having to use the D-pad to control the aim is very strange. The fact that the PS1 controller doesn't have as many buttons as a keyboard also limits the gameplay a lot. And of course, Delta Force Urban Warfare is very beautiful for a 32-bit console, but obviously the PS1 can deliver the same technical capacities as a PC. And just like other PS1 and Nintendo 64 games did, Delta Force Urban Warfare takes a very different approach than other games. The lore expanded on urban combat scenarios, depicting diverse, highly realistic and complex environments like major cities, densely populated areas, and ruined urban zones. It focused on the unique challenge of combat in these settings, where soldiers face organized enemies, civilians, and the critical infrastructure. This created a richer narrative where military decisions have direct consequences not only on the battlefield, but also the civilian population, exploring issues like rules of engagement, combat ethics, and the impact of urban warfare. The narrative became more grounded in real-world dynamics, addressing terrorism, counter-narcotics, and modern urban warfare. It showcased how special forces adapted to these new realities, making the story more relevant to current global conflicts. In summary, to adapt to the limitations of the PS1, Urban Warfare brings an immersive experience in different ways from previous games and brought a greater focus on the narrative, the characters, and you even have cutscenes now. In summary, it's a good game, but unfortunately it suffered because of the limitations of the PS1. But okay, cause the following year, big things awaited PC gamers. In 2003 was released Delta Force Black Hawk Down for PC again, and this is just the best game of the franchise. But before talking about the game, let's talk about what inspired it. Black Hawk Down, A Story of Modern War, is a book written by Mark Bowden, published in 1999. It details the events of the Battle of Mogadishu that took place on October 3, 1993. In these operations, US forces, primarily Delta Force and Rangers, attempted to capture Somali warlords. What was meant to be a routine mission quickly turned into a fierce battle when two Black Hawk helicopters were shot down, leading to a desperate fight to rescue stranded soldiers in the middle of a heavily armed Somali neighborhood. The book delves into personal accounts, combat details, and the aftermath of the event, exploring the challenges faced by US forces and the extreme violence of the and it was so good that it inspired Delta Force Black Hawk Down. The game focused on events as described in the book. Nova Logic's developers used the book as the source to understand the soldiers' experiences, military tactics, and the environment of urban warfare in Mogadishu. While the game took creative liberties, it made an effort to capture the spirit and details of the operations described in the book, including the weapons, vehicles, and the challenging conditions of combat. The missions were designed to immerse players in situations reflective of those described in the book, with an emphasis on teamwork, military tactics, and survival in hostile environments. Delta Force Black Hawk Down had an expansion called Team Sabre. The expansion introduced new missions set in different locations beyond Mogadishu, with operations taking place in new parts of the world. These missions involved rescue operations and combat against enemy factions in new contests. Black Hawk Down Team Sabre was an expansion that greatly enhanced the gameplay experience experience by offering new missions, maps, units, and vehicles, while maintaining the focus on the realism and strategic gameplay that made the original game popular. Black Hawk Down was the peak of the franchise, surpassing Delta Force 2 and become one of the best FPS games of that year. My only criticism of this doesn't necessarily have to do with the game itself, but rather with the direction the franchise was taking. Delta Force 1 and 2 were 100% tactical, but starting with Land War, we started to see a subtle change in how the game worked, and in Black Hawk Down, they left the tactical factor much more aside and placed more emphasis on action than on stealth. Delta Force games were changing, but okay, at least the change was good. Black Hawk Down is extremely fun to play, and its formula was used for the release of Joint Ops Typhoon Rising in 2004, another Nova Logic game that was very similar to Delta Force and compacted directly with Battlefield 2. In 2005, Black Hawk Down was released for PlayStation 2 and Xbox, which further increased the game's popularity. Many people I know had Black Hawk Down as their gateway to the franchise, but that wasn't the only thing that happened with Delta Force in 2005. A partial remake of the first Delta Force game was released called Delta Force Extreme. The gameplay of the game is very good and honestly is the most satisfying of the franchise. The ADS, besides being an evolution of Black Hawk Down, also looks more like what we see in current games. The highlight of Extreme is the addition of vehicles. Now you can use motorcycles and other things during missions, and the handling here is surprisingly good. It's an addition that this new style of Delta Force games need. Extreme combined elements of realism with fast-paced action, making it more accessible to casual players while still appealing to competitive players. The game focused on faster missions with more immediate, close combat action, and vehicles use added a new layer of intensity. But the praise ends now, cause in some other points, this remake is worse than the original game. Firstly, they didn't remake all the Delta Force 1 missions, just the Peru, Shed, and Novaya Zemlya parts. They simply ignored Uzbekistan and Indonesia in this game. And secondly, Extreme is far from having the same vibe as the original game. Many things here have been redesigned, and the game after a while got a little boring. Black Hawk Down was still a better experience to play than Extreme, and after the release of this remake, everything started to go wrong. The Business Software Alliance (BSA) on Wednesday issued a fine of $153,000 to California-based game developer Nova Logic, creator of the Delta Force franchise and Comanche 4, for using unlicensed software in the construction of its video games, according to a report in the local Ventura County Star newspaper. An audit issued by BSA found unlicensed copies of software from Adobe, Apple, Autodesk, FileMaker, Macromedia, Microsoft, and Symantec on Nova Logic employee computers, according to the news outlet. Basically, Nova Logic was sued by illegal software. At the same time, another game called Delta Force Angel Fall started to be developed, and because of this, the development of the sequel to Delta Force Extreme took a long time. In fact, it was Delta Force game that took the longest time to be released, and when Extreme 2 was released, the game was hated by players. The game was released in 2009 and had graphics practically identical to the first game. The game brings practically nothing new. On the contrary, the missions are extremely mediocre. The game has only 2 campaigns with 5 missions in each one. If this game didn't exist, no one would miss it, and it only served to tarnish the franchise that had previously only had good games despite the reservations. In 2011, Modern Warfare 3 was released, a game where you could play as Delta Force in American missions. The problem is that the Delta Force logo in Modern Warfare 3 was very similar to the logo of Delta Force games. Then Nova Logic sued Activision and lost the lawsuit. Angel Fall was cancelled shortly after, and in 2016 Nova Logic was closed, and the rights to the games were passed to THQ Nordic, and later the Delta Force IP arrived at Tencent, and then a reboot of the franchise was announced in 2023, receiving the open beta in December 2024 exclusively for PC and officially releasing for consoles and mobile in January 2025. And I don't know what I think about this reboot, but okay, this is not the subject for this video. The end of Nova Logic and the end of Delta Force, as we know, is sad, but we can learn a great lesson from it. The first two games are true technical miracles. Nowadays, it may seem that this is not true, since Half-Life, released before Delta Force 1, is visually better, but you have to understand that both games are technically impressive, but in different aspects. The second game improved every aspect of the first, and even though it wasn't as visually beautiful as Half-Life, it's still technically impressive. I use Half-Life as example, but you can compare Delta Force with many PC FPS games released in the late 2000s. Even though Delta Force 1 and 2 weren't as visually beautiful as other games of their time, it were still technical miracles, and so there were almost no complaints that the games were outdated. But as time went by, complaints that the games were outdated and complaints about the lack of innovation increased. The franchise was changing its course. From tactical FPS games, Delta Force began to focus more on action, and okay, Black Hawk Down was the peak of the franchise, but everything that came after it couldn't surpass it in technical terms. I consider Land War worse than Delta Force 2, but not for technical reasons. My criticisms are directed at trivial things that you simply may not care about. For example, I don't like the FOV of Land War, but okay, you may not care about the FOV. You may not care about the design of certain weapons being horrible, and this is okay. Urban Warfare can't be considered in the discussion because the reason it's technically inferior to the previous ones is obvious. The game is for PS1 and it fulfills its function well as a PS1 game. But when you look at Extreme 1 and 2, you see almost no technical advancement compared to Black Hawk Down. If you take the vehicles out of Extreme 1, the game will feel like a Black Hawk Down expansion remaking the Delta Force 1 missions and adding a slightly better ADS. Extreme 2 suffers from this problem even more, and to make matters worse, the game is bad. It seems that unlike Rainbow Six, Delta Force simply stopped in time, and to make matters worse, Angel Fall was cancelled and they simply decided to sue Activision and lost. In this video I only talked about Nova Logic's mistakes related to the Delta Force franchise, and the closure of the developer in 2016 was the final nail in the coffin for this franchise until the release of the reboot. All of Nova Logic's mistakes with Delta Force can simply be summed up as stupidity. If they weren't stupid, they wouldn't have faced problems and created problems in court. If they weren't stupid, maybe their treatment of Delta Force after Black Hawk Down might have been different, but no, and in the end, the only thing we can do is sit back, play the old games, and see how the new Delta Force performs. And guys, this is how Stupidity almost killed Delta Force.